The first thing my wife said to me in court was, "You are useless." And in that moment, I realized she wasn't trying to win the case. She was trying to erase me. The courtroom in downtown Chicago felt colder than it should have, fluorescent lights reflecting off polished wood as people settled into seats expecting a simple divorce hearing. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, just another ending to another marriage. But the second Emily Carter looked at me, I knew this was not going to be ordinary. She didn't even hesitate when her lawyer stood up, adjusting his tie like he owned the room, and said to the judge that I had contributed nothing meaningful to the marriage, no financial stability worth mentioning, no emotional leadership, no future worth preserving. I stayed seated, hands folded, breathing steady, because something in me had already decided that reacting would only feed what they wanted, and I could feel eyes turning toward me like I was already a finished story. Emily didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't look conflicted. She just spoke about me like I was a mistake she had finally corrected, telling the court that I had been comfortable while she had been ambitious, that I had been present but never powerful, and every word she said landed with practiced precision, as if she had rehearsed erasing me line by line. Her attorney followed up immediately, sliding printed documents across the table, pointing out numbers, accounts, and assumptions that painted me as irrelevant, and I could hear faint reactions from the gallery, small shifts in chairs, subtle judgment forming in real time. The judge, William Hartley, maintained a neutral expression, but I could see the weight of perception building in the room, the kind that decides cases before evidence ever gets reviewed. Emily finally turned to me directly, her voice calm but cutting, and said she hoped I would stop pretending I had any real claim to our shared assets, because in her words, I had already taken enough by simply being there. That was when I felt it, not anger, not panic, but a strange stillness, like something inside me had stepped back to observe instead of react, because what no one in that room understood was that I hadn't come here to argue about feelings or memories, or who contributed more to a life that was already over. I had come here with something they hadn't asked about yet, something they didn't know existed. My attorney, Sarah Bennett, leaned slightly toward me and whispered if I was ready, but I didn't answer right away, because I was watching Emily too closely now, watching the certainty in her posture, the confidence in how she believed the story had already ended in her favor. The judge asked if either side had additional statements before preliminary rulings, and that was when I finally stood up, slowly, deliberately, feeling the entire room shift its attention toward me. As I said, there was one document the court needed to see before anything else moved forward, and in that instant, I noticed something I had been waiting for. Emily's expression didn't change immediately, but her confidence flickered just enough for me to know she had no idea what was coming next. The entire room seemed to hold its breath the moment I finished speaking, as if even the air itself was waiting to see whether what I had just said was confidence or desperation. Emily Carter let out a small, almost dismissive exhale, the kind of sound someone makes when they believe the ending is already written, and her attorney immediately adjusted a stack of papers, preparing to object before anything even began, while I calmly placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of the judge. Judge William Hartley looked at it without touching it at first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he asked me to confirm what exactly I was submitting, and I responded in a steady voice that it was a single governing document related to the financial structure of our marriage and asset ownership agreements that had never been reviewed in the current proceedings. That was when Emily finally smiled, not warmly, but with the kind of certainty that comes from believing someone is about to embarrass themselves in public, and she leaned slightly toward her lawyer as if to share an inside joke. Her attorney immediately stood and argued that any late submission should be considered irrelevant, without prior disclosure, suggesting it was a delay tactic, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to wait, and that small gesture alone shifted the atmosphere in the room. I could feel it then, the subtle change from judgment to curiosity, the way a courtroom becomes quiet not because it is calm, but because something unexpected is approaching. The judge finally opened the envelope, removed a set of documents, and began reading slowly, his expression neutral but gradually tightening as he progressed line by line. Emily watched him closely at first, still confident, still composed, tapping her fingers lightly against her arm as if she was merely waiting for procedural confirmation. But then the rhythm of her movement changed, almost imperceptibly. as the reading continued longer than she expected. Her attorney leaned forward, trying to glance at the pages, but the judge raised them slightly, continuing without interruption. I did not look at Emily yet, because I already knew what was coming before anyone else fully processed it. The document outlined a financial and legal structure established years earlier, a structure that had been activated quietly through clauses she had either overlooked or dismissed, including a binding agreement that separated specific assets from marital claims under conditions she had unknowingly fulfilled. It also referenced transactions and contributions tied to accounts she had assumed were joint, but were legally categorized under a protected trust arrangement that required mutual consent for claims that had not been granted. As the judge turned another page, I finally heard Emily speak under her breath, asking her lawyer what exactly he was looking at, but there was no confidence in her voice anymore, only confusion trying to disguise itself as control. The judge paused for the first time, looking up over his glasses, and asked both attorneys to approach, which caused a ripple of tension through the courtroom that even the observers could feel. Emily stood as well, her movements slower now, less certain, as if the floor beneath her had shifted slightly without warning. When she reached the bench, the judge pointed to a specific clause, and I saw her expression change the moment she recognized a name or detail she had not expected to see there. Her lawyer attempted to interject, but the judge cut him off, stating clearly that if the document was valid, several of the claims being made in this case would need immediate reassessment before any further argument could proceed. That was the first moment Emily Carter stopped smiling completely, and for the first time since the hearing began, she looked at me not as if I was irrelevant, but as if she was realizing she had misunderstood something fundamental about the entire situation. The moment the judge lifted his eyes from the document, the entire courtroom seemed to tighten, as if every person present understood that something irreversible had just begun to unfold. Judge William Hartley slowly turned another page, his expression no longer neutral, but focused in a way that suggested the words in front of him were not routine legal language, but something that carried weight far beyond what either side had prepared for. Emily Carter stood frozen beside her attorney, her earlier confidence now replaced with a stillness that looked less like control and more like uncertainty trying not to show itself. I remained seated, hands folded, watching without interruption, because I already knew the structure of what he was reading, even if they did not. The judge paused again, this time longer, and asked my attorney, Sarah Bennett, to confirm the origin of the document. Sarah responded calmly that it was part of a legally executed agreement filed under a private trust structure established years prior, and that it governed specific classifications of marital and financial ownership that were relevant to the current claims. Emily's attorney immediately objected, insisting that no such structure had been disclosed during discovery, but the judge raised a hand again, signaling for silence, and began reading further down the page. That was when the shift in the room became undeniable. The judge's tone changed slightly as he read aloud portions referencing a trust arrangement tied to shared assets that had been reclassified under conditions signed during the early years of the marriage, including clauses that transferred control authority under specific circumstances that appeared to have already been triggered. Emily leaned toward her lawyer, whispering sharply that she had never seen such language before, but her voice carried less certainty now and more urgency. The attorney quickly flipped through his own copy, scanning faster, his expression tightening as he tried to locate a counterargument that was not immediately obvious. I noticed Emily's hands begin to tremble slightly, though she quickly hid them by crossing her arms, attempting to maintain composure. The judge then asked a question that changed everything. He wanted confirmation on whether Emily Carter had signed any supplementary acknowledgement confirming awareness of trust conditions during a financial restructuring event 3 years earlier. There was a pause, and then Sarah Bennett stood and stated that such acknowledgement had been digitally signed and time-stamped, and that it was included as an appendix to the current submission. Emily's head turned sharply toward her lawyer at that moment, as if expecting immediate denial or correction, but none came quickly enough. The judge reviewed the appendix himself, scrolling through signatures and timestamps, then leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling through his nose, as if the picture forming in front of him had just become clearer than expected. He then stated in a measured voice that if the signature and structure were valid, then several of the claims being pursued by the plaintiff would not hold under current legal interpretation without substantial revision. The words landed in silence. Emily finally spoke, insisting that she had never intended to waive any rights and that there must be a misunderstanding, but her voice lacked the firmness it had carried earlier. Her attorney attempted to argue procedural misrepresentation, but the judge interrupted again, pointing out that intent and execution were two different matters under the law. I watched Emily's posture change completely in that moment. The certainty she had entered the courtroom with dissolving into visible disbelief as she realized. The case she believed was straightforward was no longer standing on stable ground. The judge then requested a short recess to review all submitted materials in full, but before he adjourned, he asked for one final clarification regarding a clause buried near the end of the document, the clause that referenced a single controlling provision that had not yet been discussed aloud. And as he prepared to read it, I noticed Emily staring at me directly for the first time without anger or confidence, but with the quiet realization that the outcome she had expected was no longer within her control. The courtroom remained completely silent as Judge William Hartley adjusted his glasses and returned to the final section of the document. The atmosphere now so tense that even the smallest movement felt amplified under the bright overhead lights. Emily Carter stood motionless near her attorney, her earlier confidence now replaced by a rigid stillness that suggested she was trying to anticipate a correction that never came. I could feel the shift in energy across the room, not because anyone had spoken louder, but because the direction of control had quietly changed hands without ceremony. The judge began reading the final clause aloud, and as he did, his tone became slower, more deliberate, as if each word required careful consideration before being spoken. The clause referenced a controlling provision embedded within the original agreement, a provision that granted decisive authority over the classification and division of jointly held assets under specific financial conditions that had already been met years earlier without dispute. Emily's attorney immediately leaned in, scanning his copy again with increasing urgency, but the judge continued without pause, emphasizing that the language was not ambiguous when read in full legal context, and that its execution appeared properly documented and legally binding. That was when Emily finally spoke again, her voice sharper than before, insisting that such a provision could not possibly override standard marital asset division laws. But the interruption in her tone betrayed something she was trying to suppress, a growing realization that the argument she had prepared was no longer aligned with what the document actually stated. The judge raised his hand slightly, signaling her to wait, and then continued reading the final sentence of the clause, which confirmed that upon activation of the specified conditions, full controlling interest over designated financial holdings would transfer to the secondary party listed in the agreement, subject to court verification of authenticity. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than normal, as if the courtroom itself needed time to process what had just been confirmed. Emily turned toward her attorney fully now, her expression no longer confident or even defensive, but searching, as though expecting him to provide an explanation that would restore balance to the situation. But he did not speak immediately. Instead, he flipped back through the pages repeatedly, his face tightening as he realized there was no missing page, no procedural error, and no obvious legal dismissal he could rely on. Sarah Bennett, standing beside me, remained composed, simply watching the judge as he set the document down for a moment and asked for verbal confirmation from both legal teams regarding authenticity and prior acknowledgement. Emily's attorney hesitated before answering, carefully stating that while the document appeared properly executed, he would need additional time to verify internal references and supporting filings. But the judge interrupted again, pointing out that verification of signatures and timestamps had already been independently cross-checked with submitted records and that no immediate discrepancies had been found. At that moment, Emily's composure finally cracked, not dramatically, but in a subtle shift of posture as she took a half step back, as if the floor beneath her had become less certain. She spoke again, quieter this time, asking how such a clause could have existed without her clear understanding of its implications, and for the first time, her voice carried something other than control. It carried doubt. The judge did not respond immediately, instead looking directly at both attorneys and stating that the court would now interpret the document in full during final review, but before he adjourned, he added a final observation that any claims built on assumptions contrary to a valid controlling provision would need substantial reconsideration. The sound of his voice lowering the gavel slightly onto the desk marked a transition that everyone in the room felt instinctively, because what had begun as a straightforward dispute was no longer heading toward a predictable conclusion. And as Emily slowly turned her gaze back toward me, there was no longer any trace of certainty left in her expression, only the quiet realization that the structure she had depended on was no longer standing the way she believed it was. The silence that followed the judge's last statement did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as if the entire courtroom had been forced to accept that the direction of the case had permanently shifted without warning. Judge William Hartley kept his eyes on the document for a few seconds longer, then slowly placed it back on the desk in front of him with deliberate control, as if confirming to himself that what he had just read was not open to interpretation. Emily Carter remained standing, but her posture had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible at first. Her shoulders no longer squared with confidence, but held with a tension that suggested she was trying to stay composed under pressure she did not anticipate. Her attorney leaned in quickly, whispering something that I could not hear, but his expression already showed uncertainty replacing certainty, as if he had shifted from advocacy into damage control. The judge finally spoke again, asking both legal teams to address the court regarding the enforceability of the controlling provision and whether any evidence existed that would invalidate its execution or intent. Emily's attorney responded immediately, attempting to argue that the clause should be considered non-binding due to lack of informed consent. But the judge interrupted him mid-sentence, pointing out that consent had already been verified through multiple authenticated signatures and supporting records that had been submitted without dispute. That interruption alone changed the tone of the room again, because it removed the possibility of framing the issue as misunderstanding and placed it firmly into the category of execution under law. Emily finally stepped forward slightly, asking the court directly how she could be held accountable for a provision she claimed she never fully understood, and for the first time her voice carried something closer to frustration than confidence, as if the structure she relied on was no longer responding to her arguments. The judge did not respond immediately, instead reviewing a highlighted section of the document again before stating that legal enforceability does not require subjective recollection of every clause when proper execution standards have been met and verified. That statement created a visible reaction in Emily's posture, her hands lowering slightly, as if she was no longer sure what position she was supposed to take in the room. Her attorney attempted once more to request a delay for further review, but the judge shook his head and stated that sufficient documentation had already been presented for preliminary determination and that the court would proceed accordingly. I remained seated, watching without movement, because I could feel the shift moving toward resolution faster than anyone on Emily's side seemed prepared for. The judge then summarized the implications of the controlling provision in plain terms, explaining that if upheld, it would significantly limit the scope of Emily's financial claim and reclassify key assets under the established trust framework referenced in the agreement. The words landed heavily, and I saw Emily finally break eye contact with the bench, looking down at the floor as if recalibrating everything she believed she was about to gain. A brief pause followed, and then the judge stated that based on the evidence reviewed so far, the court would issue a preliminary ruling recognizing the validity of the controlling provision pending final administrative confirmation. There was no dramatic sound, no outburst, only the quiet collapse of expectation inside a structured room that had just stopped supporting one side of the argument. Emily's attorney exhaled slowly, already calculating next steps, but Emily herself did not speak. She simply stood there as the reality settled in. And in that moment, as the judge prepared to continue outlining the next procedural steps, it became clear that the case was no longer about what either side believed had happened in the marriage, but about what had already been legally locked in long before either of them walked into that courtroom. The judge's gavel did not strike loudly, but the sound it made when it finally touched the wood carried enough finality to shift the entire atmosphere of the courtroom into something quieter, heavier, and more controlled than anything that had come before it. Judge William Hartley stated that a preliminary ruling would be entered recognizing the validity of the controlling provision, subject only to administrative confirmation, and in that moment I watched the reaction unfold not as chaos, but as a slow unraveling of certainty. Emily Carter did not speak immediately. She stood still, eyes fixed on the bench as if waiting for the words to correct themselves, but they did not. Her attorney leaned in quickly, speaking in a low, urgent tone, already discussing procedural options, appeals, and review timelines, but his voice sounded distant, as if it no longer had a clear direction to aim at. I could feel the shift across the room, not in noise but in restraint, the way people stop reacting when they realize the outcome is no longer flexible. The judge instructed both parties to prepare for a short recess, while the court finalized written confirmation of the ruling, and as he stood, the movement alone seemed to signal closure on the phase of the case that had defined all previous expectations. Emily finally sat down slowly, her posture no longer rigid, but uncertain, as if her body had lost the structure it had been holding since the hearing began. I noticed her hands resting on the table now, no longer folded with confidence, but placed loosely, almost absent of intention. As the room began to shift into procedural movement, I saw Sarah Bennett glance toward me briefly, her expression calm but focused, and she leaned slightly closer. To say that the document had done exactly what it was designed to do, but her tone carried no celebration, only confirmation. I nodded once, not because there was anything to explain, but because there was nothing left that required urgency. Emily's attorney gathered his papers quickly, speaking in short, controlled sentences about next steps, but even he seemed to understand that the strongest argument they had entered with had already been absorbed and neutralized by the court's interpretation. As people in the gallery began to move and whisper softly, Emily remained seated for a few seconds longer, staring at the table's surface as if replaying every assumption that had brought her here. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked at me directly again. But this time there was no accusation in her expression, no anger, and no confidence. Only a quiet uncertainty that suggested she was no longer measuring victory or defeat, but trying to understand how the ground had shifted without her noticing. I did not respond, because there was nothing left to respond to in that moment. The judge exited through the side door, and the courtroom gradually loosened into motion, chairs shifting, papers being collected, voices returning at a lower volume. But the tension did not disappear, it simply changed shape. Emily stood again, this time without urgency, and gathered her belongings slowly, as if each movement required more consideration than before. Her attorney spoke to her briefly, but she only nodded once without looking at him, then glanced toward the exit. I remained seated until she began walking, not toward me, not toward the bench, but toward the aisle that would take her out of the courtroom, and as she passed, her pace slowed slightly, not enough to stop, but enough to acknowledge that the outcome she had expected had already moved beyond her reach. And as the door at the far end of the room closed behind her, I realized the case had not ended with a confrontation or a final argument, but with a single document that had rewritten everything before anyone fully understood it was happening. The courthouse steps in downtown Chicago felt different after the hearing ended, as if the building itself had released pressure everyone inside had been carrying without realizing it. People moved in smaller groups now, voices lower, eyes no longer fixed on a single outcome, while Emily Carter remained near the bottom of the steps longer than anyone else. The wind outside was colder than inside the courtroom, and she held her coat tightly as if trying to steady her thoughts. I walked out a few minutes after her, not because I was avoiding her, but because there was nothing left that required urgency. Sarah Bennett followed beside me, reviewing a final message confirming the judge's written order would be filed by end of day. She said everything had gone as expected, but her tone carried no celebration, only closure. As we reached the steps, I saw Emily speaking quickly to her attorney, asking about appeal timelines and anything that might still exist as an opening. But the attorney's responses were slower and less confident, as if each option carried less certainty than the last. I paused halfway down the steps because I noticed Emily looking at me again, no longer with disbelief, but with something closer to recalculation. She walked a few steps toward me, then stopped, keeping distance that felt intentional rather than emotional. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the sound of traffic filled the silence between us. Then she asked quietly if I had known about the document all along. I said I had known what it contained, but not what she believed it meant. That distinction seemed to settle something in her expression, not resolve it, but soften it into understanding she did not want to accept yet. Her attorney called her name from behind, reminding her of a scheduled follow-up meeting, but she did not move immediately. Instead, she looked past me toward the courthouse doors, as if trying to see the version of the day that no longer existed. Sarah stepped closer and said we should leave, and I agreed. But before we turned away, I noticed Emily exhale slowly, releasing confidence she had entered with. I began walking down the remaining steps, and as I did, I heard no final argument, only the sound of papers being shuffled behind me. At the bottom, I did not look back, because there was nothing left to confirm, only a process already complete. Sarah mentioned final administrative confirmation would arrive within days, but the ruling was already effective in practice. I nodded, not thinking about what came next, but aware that what ended inside that courtroom was more than a claim. It was an assumption that had never been as strong as it appeared. As we crossed toward the street, I could feel the city moving around us in its usual rhythm, horns, footsteps, distant conversations, all continuing as if nothing had changed, but I knew something fundamental had already shifted beneath everything that had just happened. I did not feel victory or loss, only clarity, the kind that arrives when expectations no longer shape what comes next. Behind us, the courthouse stood still and heavy, holding the version of the story that had already finished writing itself without permission. The drive away from the courthouse felt quieter than the trial itself, as if the city of Chicago had absorbed the last traces of tension and replaced them with an ordinary afternoon that did not reflect what had just changed in my life. Traffic moved at its usual pace, people crossing streets with coffee in hand, buses stopping and starting, and nothing in the world acknowledging that something legally irreversible had just concluded moments earlier. Sarah Bennett sat beside me in silence for several blocks before finally saying that the court's written confirmation would finalize everything within the next business day, and that no further hearings were currently scheduled unless an appeal was formally filed. Her tone was professional, steady, and without emphasis, as if she had seen enough cases to understand that finality rarely announces itself loudly. I kept my eyes on the road, not because I was avoiding thought, but because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing urgent demanding an answer from me. My phone vibrated once in the cup holder, then again, and when I glanced at it, I saw Emily Carter's name appear on the screen. I did not pick up. The vibration stopped, then started again a minute later, and then stopped entirely. Sarah noticed, but did not comment. After a few more blocks, she said that most cases of this type settled into silence after the ruling phase, not because emotions disappeared, but because structure replaced uncertainty. I understood what she meant without needing further explanation. When I finally arrived home later that afternoon, there was no dramatic moment waiting, only the familiar quiet of an ordinary house that suddenly felt less uncertain than it had in weeks. I placed my keys on the counter and stood for a moment without moving, letting the absence of conflict settle in. The document that had dominated the courtroom no longer felt heavy, only final. Later that evening, another notification appeared on my phone confirming that the judge had signed the formal order and that all terms outlined during the hearing were now enforceable pending administrative filing. There was no additional commentary, no interpretation, only confirmation. I set the phone down and looked out the window, noticing how normal everything still appeared outside, as if nothing significant had shifted. A few hours later, I received a final message from Sarah confirming that Emily's legal team had acknowledged receipt of the ruling and was reviewing options internally, but no immediate procedural challenge had been filed. That sentence carried a kind of closure that did not require elaboration. I did not respond to it. Instead, I sat down and thought about how most moments that change everything rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. They feel procedural, structured, almost restrained, and only later do they reveal their weight. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only a quiet understanding that what had been contested was no longer contested at all. Later that night, I checked my phone one last time before turning it face down. There were no new messages, no calls, no further attempts to reopen what had already been decided. In that silence, I realized the absence of reaction was itself the final confirmation that the process had completed its course. Not everything ends with resolution that feels emotional or satisfying. Some endings simply remove uncertainty and leave behind clarity. And as I sat there in the dim light of the room, I understood that the courtroom was no longer a place I needed to return to, because everything it contained had already been translated into something permanent outside of it. The days after the court ruling settled into a quiet that felt different from uncertainty, a quiet that carried structure instead of tension, and I found myself waking up without the same sense of anticipation that had defined the weeks before. There was no longer a need to check messages with hesitation or replay conversations in my mind, because everything that had required explanation had already been reduced to a final written order. The document that once filled a courtroom now existed only as confirmation in an administrative system, and even that felt distant from daily life. Sarah Bennett called once more to confirm that all filings were complete and that no further action was expected unless an appeal was formally initiated. But even she sounded like someone closing a file rather than continuing a case. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat in silence for a while without reaching for anything to fill it. In the following days, I noticed how quickly routine returned when conflict was removed from it. Work resumed its normal rhythm. Emails replaced court notifications, and meetings replaced legal discussions, yet there was a clarity in every task that had not been there before. One afternoon, I received a final notification confirming the administrative seal had been placed on the ruling, making it fully enforceable without remaining procedural steps. I read it once and did not feel the need to read it again. Later that week, I saw Emily Carter briefly outside a public building downtown. She was standing near the entrance speaking to someone on the phone, her posture composed but quieter than I remembered from the courtroom. Our eyes met for only a moment, and there was no confrontation, no attempt to speak, only recognition of a shared ending that no longer required negotiation. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned away as her call continued. I continued walking, not because I was avoiding her, but because there was nothing left to resolve between us. That was the first time I fully understood that closure does not always arrive with resolution between people, but sometimes with separation of their stories. Over the next few weeks, the memory of the courtroom began to lose its sharp edges. What remained was not conflict, but sequence, the sequence of events that led from assumption to documentation, from documentation to interpretation, and from interpretation to final enforcement. I no longer thought about what could have been argued differently, because the outcome had already been determined by structure rather than emotion. One evening, I stood by the window and reflected on how quickly perception changes when certainty replaces speculation. What had once felt like a battle had become a record, and what had once felt personal had become procedural. There was no victory speech, no moment of celebration, only the quiet recognition that some outcomes are defined not by intensity, but by permanence. As night settled outside, I realized I had stopped waiting for anything to change, because nothing needed to. The case was no longer something I was inside of. It was something that had already completed its cycle without needing further attention. And in that understanding, I finally felt the absence of noise not as emptiness, but as resolution. It was not the end I expected, but it was the first time I felt completely free moving forward.